Hello friends, I am Arpit and I am here with today's analysis. Today is 25th of November and we are going to deal with two very important topics which are in news. The first topic is emission gap report. This has been pending for a few days, but yes, we had a lot of topics to cover, so we are picking up this topic today. Now, what is this emission gap report? First of all, this report is released by UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme. This report is released every year, just before the COP of UNFCCC is to happen. Presently, the COP, that is Conference of Parties of UNFCCC, is going to start from I think around 29th or 30th of November, and it is going to go till 12th of December. And this COP is going to be held in UAE. So before that, this emission gap report is released by UNEP. Now, what is this emission gap report? Emissions coming out from vehicles, industries, from agricultural fields. All these are, I would say, called as emissions, and these emissions are contributing in global warming. The emission gap is what emissions we are emitting or what we are mandated to emit according to our INDCs, that is nationally determined contributions, which we for the very first time submitted in Paris Pact under the Paris Pact in 2015 and then upgrade them in 2021 in Copenhagen. So emissions according to our INDCs, which we are expected to emit, versus those emissions which are needed to be emitted if we want to keep the global average temperatures within limits. So this gap, I'm repeating it again, is between the emissions we are mandated to emit under our INDCs, which are obviously high, and the emissions which we should be emitting if we want to keep the global temperatures in limits. This gap between them is known as the emission gap. Means our INDCs are not adequate enough right now. Since we've started with the INDCs, so initially only, or in the first stance only, we could not keep our INDCs which could be keeping the global temperatures within limits. This gap would have been technically zero then, but since we have started it, earlier this gap was more, now it is gradually reducing, but yes, this gap is there. And what are the global average limits according to this particular standard? Those global average temperatures should be around x plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. At times, we refer it to as 2 degrees Celsius also. By the year 2100. And what is this x? This is pre-industrial temperatures. Pre-industrial temperatures, the average temperature of these 50 years, 1850 to 1900, is x. And by the end of this century, that is by 2100, we have to achieve x plus 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. That is this limit where the emissions should be. It should be taking the global average temperatures. The emissions should be taking the global average temperatures to this limit. But presently, our INDCs are, making this much emissions to happen. Means more emissions to happen. The INDCs have to be revised in 2025. Maybe at that time, this gap will further lower down. Next is PM Mudra Yojana. It is basically a yojana for disbursing loans for entrepreneurship. Loans can be disbursed up to a maximum of 10 lakh rupees under this yojana. There was a statement by one of the ministers and said in that statement that we are going to prioritize females for this loan. So that is why it was in news. So we will be picking up these two topics for discussions. Now this emission gap report. This year's emission gap report was named as Broken Record temperature hit new highs, yet world, fails to cut emissions again. This was the title of this year's emission gap report. Emissions, we do any economic activity, emissions will be there. You produce, let's suppose, this pen in a factory, emissions will be there. This pen is transported from one place to the other place, emissions will be there. For any economic activity, emissions will be there. Agricultural sector, emissions will be there. Services sector, you use electricity, emissions will be there. In a nutshell, if I have to say, if you want to develop, emissions will be there. But there should be some limit to the emissions. And, these emissions are causing global warming or climate change. It is the greenhouse gases which get emitted, cause the greenhouse effect, trap the heat, and cause global warming. So, emissions should be under control. Now, there are certain things which we need to understand this emission gap report. Emission gap is that gap between the emissions which we are doing or are mandated under our INDCs which we have pledged in the United Nations after 2015. This is this level. The top means more emissions we are doing or we are mandated to do, at least as of now according to our INDCs, and the emissions which we should be doing to keep the global average temperatures within the universally accepted limits, that is x plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. Means 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. Pre-industrial levels were 1850 to 1900. So that gap between emissions which are mandated by our INDCs and the emissions actually which are required to keep the global warming in permissible limits, this gap is called as emission gap, and this report highlights all about it. This year, that is 2022, this report was for. 2023 is not complete. The report for 2023 will be tabled in 2024. But in 2022 alone, there were around 86 days where we have surpassed this x plus 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. So that is something which is startling, and that is why we have broken the record. There were maximum, I would say, greenhouse gas emissions. September was the hottest ever month in the history of mankind. That is why records were broken. So ahead of COP28, the United Nations Environment Programme released the report titled Emissions Gap Report 2023. The title was Broken Record, Temperature Hit New Highs, Yet World Fails to Cut Emissions Again. You can see this over here. This is a screenshot from the UNEP's website only. Now the report, the UNEP Emissions Gap Report series tracks world progress in limiting global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing 1.5 degrees Celsius in line with the Paris Agreement. This 1.5 degrees Celsius goal was kept or was adopted in COP21 2015, known as the Paris Agreement. That by 2100, by the end of this century, the global average temperatures should not exceed by 1.5 degrees Celsius the pre-industrial level temperatures. This was the goal which we set. And in order to meet this goal, emissions have to be less. That is why it is at the lower, I would say, level. That this much emissions should be there, which will help us meet this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal by 2100. But presently in 2022, 86 days, we have surpassed this 1.5 degrees. That is where we are standing right now. So, it is all, I would say, by the courtesy of these increased emissions. Now, since 2010, it has provided an annual science-based assessment of the gap between estimated future global greenhouse gas emissions if countries implement their climate mitigation pledges. These are called as nationally determined contributions, and where they should be to avoid the worst impact of climate change. Where they should be to avoid the worst impact of climate change is this. Each year, the report also highlights key opportunities to bridge emissions gap, tackling a specific issue of interest. With the aim to inform the climate negotiations among UN member states, the Emission Gap Report is launched every year ahead of the UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties. So, every year, this report is launched. Key findings of EGR 2023. The global temperatures are rising. We know that. But up to what extent they are rising? Let us see according to this emission gap report. 86 days have been recorded with temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we want this target to be achieved by 2100, which we have already, surpassed. So, this is something which is startling. Not only was September the hottest month ever, it also exceeded the previous record by an unprecedented 0.5 degrees Celsius, with global average temperatures at 1.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels in September. So we are dreaming of, achieving this goal by 2100, that temperatures should not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial levels. But in September 2022, temperatures already exceeded 1.8 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. So that is something which needs to be understood. Then global greenhouse gas emissions set new record. The greenhouse gas emissions were also, at an all-time high, and these greenhouse gas emissions are trapping the heat, and that is why the temperatures are rising. The global greenhouse gas emissions increased by 1.2% from 2021 to 2022 to reach a new record of 57.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. All sectors apart from the transport sector. This is something which is remarkable because of introduction of EVs. Transport sector emissions have come down, have fully rebounded from the drop in emissions induced by the COVID-19 pandemic. When the COVID-19 pandemic came, emissions came down. But now, all sectors have rebounded except for the transport sector, and they have exceeded the 2019 levels. CO2 emissions from fossil fuels combustion and industrial processes were the main contributors to the overall increase, accounting for about 2/3 of the current greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we can see these greenhouse gas emissions. The grey portion which we are seeing, obviously, this one, are the fossil fuels. This portion is methane, that is CH4, which is also a very high potential, I would say, greenhouse gas. Then this is nitrous oxide, the blue one which you are seeing. The yellow one, which is obviously very less but it is increasing gradually, are the fluorinated gases. Okay. And this green portion which you are seeing is land use change carbon dioxide. Like we grow rice, and when we grow rice, methane is emitted from the rice fields. That is, emissions from land use. So it is like this. So, these are the probable contributors of greenhouse gases. Fossil CO2 means by burning fossil fuels, that is the major contributor. Then CH4, then we have this blue portion, nitrous oxide, the yellow portion, fluorinated gases like CFC and all, they are also considered as greenhouse gases. And then finally the green portion which you are seeing is land use change, CO2. Now per capita territorial GHG emissions vary significantly across the countries. Now per capita GHG emissions, like the global average is 6.5 tons of CO2. But many countries like United States, Russia, they have exceeded it. They have more than double the world average. Means in USA and Russia, there is more than 13 tons of CO2, per capita which is being emitted, which is obviously, I would say, disturbing. Whereas India remains under half of it, means less than 3.25 tons of CO2 per capita is being emitted in a year. Per capita emissions are fairly similar in Brazil, European Union and Indonesia, and at levels slightly below the G20 average. Historic emissions and contribution to global warming similarly vary significantly across countries and groups of countries. Now, action in this decade will determine the ambition required in the next round of NDCs for 2035. Actually, NDCs, that is nationally determined contributions, are those contributions which have been determined by the countries itself. And what are these contributions for, or what are these determinations? That what we will do to conserve global warming or to conserve the environment. And these INDCs basically are a set of goals which every country had to submit. And it was mandated by the Paris Pact in 2015, COP21. India submitted its first set of INDCs in 2015-16. There were 3 INDCs. Then India revised its INDCs in COP26 in 2021 in Glasgow. We had now 5 set of INDCs. India's INDC, being a developing country, are very ambitious. And India has been applauded all over the world for meeting the targets it has set for itself under the INDCs. Now, obviously, one of those INDCs is to reduce emissions. Now, these INDCs are again to be revised in 2025. And, this revision in 2025 will definitely decide the goal for the next 10 years, that is 2035. And with this revised INDCs, which are going to be in picture in 2025-26, the main aim of the countries will be to reduce emissions so that this emission gap reduces. The emission gap is the gap between the emissions which are mandated under the INDCs, assuming that the countries are emitting this much, whereas countries are emitting more than this. And this level of emissions which are mandated or which are required to keep the global average temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This gap is called as emission gap. Okay. So presently our INDCs are not such that it will keep the global average temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. They are not at that level. They are at this level. But with the revised INDCs in 2025-26, we are planning to adopt such ambitious INDCs that reduce emissions and minimize this emission gaps. So let us see. The emissions gap is defined as the difference between the estimated global GHG emissions resulting from full implementation of the latest INDCs and those under least cost pathways aligned with the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. That long-term temperature goal of Paris Agreement is x plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. The first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement envisaged to inform the next round of NDCs that countries are requested to submit in 2025, which will include targets for 2035. Overall, the global ambition in the next round of NDCs must be sufficient to bring global greenhouse gas emissions in 2035 at least to the levels consistent with the below 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. So, now the NDCs which we will be adopting in 2025 should be in line with this 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius target. If it is in line, then this gap will be minimized. Global warming is estimated to be limited to 3 degrees Celsius. According to our, I would say, INDCs or according to our emissions. Forget 1.5 degrees Celsius, forget 2 degrees Celsius. By the end of this century, we will be exceeding the pre-industrial levels by 3 degrees Celsius, and that is going to be disastrous. A continuation of the levels of climate change mitigation efforts implied by current policies is estimated to limit global warming to 3 degrees Celsius throughout the century with a 66% chance. Warming is expected to increase further after 2100 as CO2 emissions are not yet projected to reach net zero levels. In the most optimistic scenario, where all conditional NDCs and net zero pledges are met, global warming is projected to be limited to 2 degrees Celsius. 1.5 degrees Celsius will not reach, it is expected 3 degrees Celsius, and after 2100 also, this global temperatures will keep on rising because net zero pledges are not going to be met. Net zero is whatever you emit, that much you suck in. That is net zero. And this is less likely to be met because India has kept a target that by 2070 it will become net zero. It is one of the INDCs of the country. Many countries have not even kept a target for themselves. They are maybe planning to become net zero beyond 2100 or near to 2100. So that will be the leading factor that why after 2100 also the global average temperatures will keep on rising. Now, need for political action. The emission gap report lists four key areas where political action is required to mitigate global warming. These four areas are setting and signaling carbon dioxide removal priorities, developing robust measurement, reporting, and verification systems to enhance credibility, harnessing synergies and co benefits with other efforts, and accelerating innovation. These are the four areas where the political intervention has to happen. And if it does not happen, then this emission gap will keep on widening. If it does not happen, then our lives will be, continue to be miserable. How it will be miserable? We may be contracting many diseases. We may be, facing shortage of water. We may be facing shortage of food. There can be increased frequency of disasters. Those are known as the climate induced disasters. These kind of difficulties we are going to face. So it is high time right now. If we want to live, a sustainable life, or if our future generations have to survive in a better world, then this 1.5 degrees Celsius target has to be met. Even in that target, if that target is met, then also, there will be problems. 2022, there were 86 such days where this target was surpassed. And we are 78 years away from to 2100 right now. And now only we are surpassing this target. So it is high time that we focus on reducing emissions. And we as individuals also, apart from the government, can take certain steps. Adopting organic lifestyle. That is what Mission Life is all about. Lifestyle for environment, which India proposed. Going out of the room, switch off the lights, switch off the fans, switch off the ACs. Use that much water which is necessary. Use more and more public transport. Try to minimize wastages. Go for more and more repair works. If there is any leakage in your homes, with respect to any sanitary, I would say, where water is leaking and all, make sure you repair them on time. These are some small steps which we can take to conserve the environment. That has to be, that definitely will go a long way. So this has to be a collective effort by the individuals, by the governments of developing, underdeveloped as well as developed countries. Every stakeholder has to have their individual roles to play. Then only this world will become a better place to live. Else, it will be, I would say, not a good place to live. The Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana. Now, to understand this, we should first understand the concept of financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is when the financial services are available to the most of the people. Which financial services? Banking, investment, pension, insurance, and credit. So this Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana is basically a yojana which provides credit to the people who want to do business. Who is eligible? The Indian citizen is eligible. Any Indian citizen who wants to do business can take loan under this Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana for his or her businesses. There's one condition that business should not be in the farm sector or agriculture sector. It should be either in the manufacturing sector, that is secondary sector, or tertiary sector, that is the services. Now recently, the Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs said that our priority is to disburse loans to the female entrepreneurs under the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana. It will also lead to women empowerment. How much loans can you take under this Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana? Actually, you can take a maximum up to 10 lakh under this. There are three categories of loans and maximum category is 10 lakh. So let us look into the details of this Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana. The Union Finance and Corporate Affairs Minister recently said women entrepreneurs are accorded first priority under the centre's flagship Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana scheme. Now about the scheme, it is a flagship scheme of Ministry of Finance, Government of India, launched on 8th April 2015. It is a financial inclusion program. Now, as I said, financial inclusion is that concept in which we are trying to include maximum people in the financial services net, Which financial services? Banking, investment, insurance, pension, credit. So there's one motto which Government of India has adopted of financial inclusion. That motto is banking the unbanked, securing the unsecured, and funding the unfunded. So this funding the unfunded component of financial inclusion is being met by Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana. Apart from this, other schemes are also there. Now about Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, the scheme are designed to bring enterprises into formal financial system or to fund the unfunded. Small borrowers can borrow from all the banks such as PSU banks, regional rural banks, cooperative banks, private sector banks can also be, you can go to private sector banks also to take loans, foreign banks, microfinance institutions, NBFCs, non-banking financial companies for loans up to 10 lakhs for non-farm income generating activities. That has to be understood. Eligibility: any Indian citizen who has a business plan for a non-farm sector income generating activity such as manufacturing, processing, trading or the service sector and whose credit need is less than 10 lakh rupees can approach any bank. PSU bank, regional rural banks, cooperative bank, private sector bank, even foreign banks for this loan. Types of loans issued, types of loan provided under the aegis of Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana. There are three categories. First is Shishu. It covers loans up to 50,000 rupees. Second is Kishore, covering loans above 50,000 and up to 5 lakh rupees. Tarun, covering loans above 5 lakh and up to rupees 10 lakh. So this is the classification. There is no subsidy for the loan given under PMMY. You don't think that government will give you interest subsidy or something like this. No, you have to repay the complete interest amount. However, if the loan proposal is linked to some government scheme wherein the government is providing capital subsidies, it will also be eligible under Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana. Then it will be applicable. Else, in normal circumstances, it will not be applicable. So this is one such, I would say, step which is favoring financial inclusion, and financial inclusion is very, very much important if we want to eradicate poverty, if we want to usher in development, and if we want to see ourselves as a Viksit Bharat or a developed country by 2047. Now, this financial inclusion, 80% of the population is financially included right now according to Government of India. It was only 47% in 2008. And this is one such example of financial inclusion, or one such instance of financial inclusion, that how people are getting access to credit and how they are benefiting out of it. So this is about the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, and this is it from today's session. I will be meeting you tomorrow now with some more informative news pieces. Till then, you guys very well know what to do. Keep studying, keep reading, keep writing, and most importantly, keep revising. Namaste. Jai Hind.